Hi everybody. This is, of course, it's an exciting time to start sharing results. I'm only starting this whole turning it around, and I'm going to present some of the findings. That's not all. There's a lot more to it. I'm still also working on the analysis, but before I get into business, I also wanted to say that if you know of anybody, any group that would like me come and visit for a smaller presentation, not exactly the same, but maybe a discussion about a specific aspect, let me know. You find me on the ECU webpage. Because, whoops, let's see. Now it's, one of the things, this is funded by the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, who paid for our accommodation and our gas money and a little bit of stipends for the students who helped. And they're very much interested in turning this around to the community. So if you have a club that needs somebody to discuss things for them, or you have some other venue, I'd be happy to come and visit. And you find me on the ECU website. And now also, some of you saw that I have some blue handouts there. I thought I'll include you in the process of collecting some more data in terms of and warm you up to the issues. Of course, I also wanted to thank all the many residents. Some of them I've talked to before, but who were talking to us. That was really great. It wouldn't have happened without them. Now, some of you might have wondered what is actually anthropology to do with Dare County, and I just, since I never miss an opportunity to kind of pitch anthropology, I wanted to say real quick, what is anthropology really about? I mean, we want to understand people and their behavior, what makes people different physically and behaviorally, and also what everybody shares in common. And so, of course, no single anthropologist does this all by him or herself, so we've got people who do biological anthropology. That's not me. I could have maybe taken the body temperature of people talking about certain things. That would have been interesting maybe, but I would have had to have a colleague doing that. There's archaeology, the study of material remains, material culture. We sometimes call it garbage studies. And then linguistic anthropology, how do people talk about certain kind of things? And there's part of that, as you will see. But cultural anthropology is really what I do. So trying to get to understand people from their point of view, to hang out with people, do participant observation. That wasn't that much possible in the Outer Banks. I guess the team and the students were more like tourists. but the core question is always, why do people do what they do? And we're studying culture, and then I'm done with this little intro. What do anthropologists study when they study culture? Culture is a set of learned behaviors, ideas, values, attitudes that influence who we are and what we do. And so we maybe can revisit that later on after I've shared a couple things with you and say, what's the culture of Dare County? Really, that's in some ways what I was after. And what we went after was, what are people thinking about the environment, about coastal management, about the local economy. Whoops. And it was inspired by the rather polarized opinions that were around about what's going to happen. Some of you maybe have seen this picture here. Those are projections about what might happen if waters rise. And so we wanted to know, what do local people think about that? And all of you have heard in the media what different more outspoken or more prominent or more visible people think about these kind of things. My main interest was, what are the people saying who are usually not speaking up? Those who are usually saying, not me, talk to somebody else. And I've often encountered people, talk to Ellen Burrs or talk to Warren Judge, and so on and so forth. And I always said, I'll do that when I get there, And I've actually heard from Warren Judge, and I'm going to meet with him one of these days, and we'll talk about the results. But it was very important to hear from most people who usually don't get to talk. Before I really jump in, I also wanted to pose this rather philosophical question. What's going on? Are we coping or are we adapting? And what's the difference, right? Coping is maybe that. This one didn't work. Let's try something else. Adapting calls for, and that's what some of these policymakers are thinking about. What do I have to do to really adapt in the long term? So there's also the short-term, long-term thing that's part of that. And how do you manage all of this? So just to set your mind up for that. And so how did we actually do that? How to find people to talk to. Some of you might have seen this postcard at some point or a flyer at some point. It wasn't actually so very easy to find people to talk to us, particularly those people who usually say, talk to somebody else, talk to somebody else. And so what we did was, flyers, postcards, mailing lists. We also volunteered in associations. Some of you might have met one or two of the students that have worked for me. One of the students who's here from Dare County, Connor, he is right off from break from UNC, and he was part of it. And we also participated in community events, and the ECU alumni list also was a godsend, so that really helped. I kept sending people email, hoping that some of them would come back to me, and they did. So because I tried to, of course, get a rather balanced sample, as we call it. I had envisioned a quota sample where I had equal distribution between gender, age, geographic region, between Hatteras, Manio, Mans Harbor, the beach towns, and income differences as far as we could tell. I'll tell you something about that in a minute. Ethnicity wasn't really an issue here in Dare County. We have maybe one or two African Americans who participated, but most people are white people. And what it ended up, it was a purposive sample. I mean, it served a particular purpose. I show you the sample of who was participating here in a minute. Those of you who've been part of it know that it was rather long, and some people stayed longer, and some people really enjoyed the conversation. I think some were dragging their feet, but once it started, actually enjoyed it. There were a lot of open-ended questions, and we didn't specifically ask, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that? We let people, we brought a couple teasing questions and then took it from there and took copious notes. We also have a sorting task, and some of you, I really brought some material from that because some of you might have been interested what came of that. And there was one, part with a sentence completion and a ranking task. So lots to do, lots to play with. And what I brought you there is what we would call, that's also a ranking, not a ranking task, but a disagree and agree. So, So what is sort of kind of the demographics? 208, I could claim is even a little bit more than that, but they're really comparable. Slightly more men than women. You also can see the age distribution here. I tried and tried to get younger people in the last couple months, or weeks rather. I got the students who worked with me, come talk to people who are younger. Wasn't so easy. So this is what came out of it. In terms of geographic distribution, Hatteras is 7 to 10% of the sample, which is more or less the distribution of the actually year-round population. So we had these different groups by geographic region. So it came out somewhat okay, I mean, rather organic sample. What we could really tell from those people who participated, and I never really turned anybody down, because part of this was getting people involved, getting people to think about things. So my mission wasn't to, okay, I've got enough people of this demographic, you can't talk anymore. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. So we continued to enroll. Anybody who wanted to was invited, and we sat down with them. So, and in terms of length of time spent in Dare County, the participants, it falls like this. So 27% were born and raised in Dare County. 14% spent, I calculated that between 50 to 75% of their lifetime in Dare County. And 33% spent about 25 to 50% of their lifetime in Dare County. And then, the other ones are less than that. And I highlighted this, these 33% a bit more, because in some ways that is what Dare County right now is more or less about, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who came from elsewhere and made things happen or influenced decision making. And so I'm actually quite happy that it came out this way, because this way it represents it rather organically, probably not to the T, but so, and I'm, some of you who know statistical procedures, whenever I was looking at different numbers, I was trying to account for the proportionality here. That's where my German gets in the way. All right, so a little bit more. Now it gets iffy. I'm not claiming that I really know how much people made or how rich they are, or what assets they have. I was basically creating groups on the basis of what people said they do for a living. Now, I might be completely off there. I absolutely admit that. But this is one of the trickiest things to get from people, particularly when you want to hear people's opinions. You can't quite ask them, what do you make? Then the interview is sort of kind of over. And if you ask people, what do you consider yourself? What are people saying? Middle class. I'm middle class, I'm middle class, I'm middle class, I'm middle class. So you don't get very far there either. So I purely based it on our idea of what we think a certain occupation falls into. And that might be wrong. But here is how I kind of divvied it up. Mid-income employed, high-income employed, and then I had another, mid-income self-employed, and that includes business owners as well as freelance people. I divided it further. I know who's a business owner and who isn't. You'll see that here in a minute too. And then high-income self-employed. But again, you know, and then if you overlap that with sort of kind of the middle age group, you kind of know the distribution. Those are our participants. Now, last thing before we look at some statements and some findings and what I make of it. Now again, I don't really have the answers, but I'm sharing these findings and I group them and I interpret them, and then maybe we can talk about it. How do we know that we know something about those opinions and attitudes? How did I actually work? Now, if you have 208, 210 scripts, I had the students all type it up. Then I pulled it all together, sorted it, put it all together. And then we've got nice software where you can ask, okay, show me in all these different scripts how many, you know, who mentioned something about change, or who mentioned something about sliding, or something about rise, something like that. And the computer program shows me that and lists me all these different things, and I code it then. I code it, you know, this means this means that, and then I can tell the program, okay, now show me every time the word rise showed up, or every time the word change showed up. And then I looked at those statements, and then I grouped together what I thought was more or less similar. And I show you a couple statements here in a moment, and you tell me if it's the same or it's something different. Of course, in the end, it's in the eye of the beholder, right? I admit that. But that's how I can claim some of the things I've been seeing. Ultimately, of course, I'm crunching numbers. With all the many sit-downs, you know, the best way to translate some of these things is by looking at numbers. So let's start with, some of you have heard about these questions. What do you treasure? And we just said, name 3 things that you treasure. Some people said my bedroom. But what I'm going to show you now is what people listed first. They had, everybody could list 3 things. And here's what 85% mentioned the wide open spaces as their favorite location. Pea Island or Coquina Beach was followed, you know, high priority. And then the woods, next at woods, Kitty Hawk Woods also were firsts. What do you consider an eyesore? Not surprising. That would have been what you guys probably would have said, right? French Fry Alley, most prominent eyesores in their county. Traffic, yeah. People, again, I didn't coax this. I just said, what's an eyesore? What would you wish to go away? And that's what they came up with. Oops, oops. And then utility poles along the bypass. So far, so good. So what about the natural environment? So we started slow, you know. When you think of the beach, what comes to mind? When you think about the sound, what comes to mind? And here are a couple statements that I pulled out that are representative for almost 80, 90% of people had 1 or 2 sentences in their script. Whoops. Mother Nature is going to carve the island the way she wants to. None of the coastline has stayed the same. Whoops. The sand shifts and the ocean shifts too. We're living on a sandbar. It's naturally moving. Nature will do what nature will do. You can't complain, but mama gets what she wants. The mama and the child, that was quite often. Now, you tell me, is that the same? Is it different? Would you code that similarly? Would you code that differently? I said that's all something to do with nature is changing, which is not really surprising when this is our American cultural model of what nature is all about. You can't tame it. It changes all the time. It's not just us here in Dare County. You know, you find that all over America, that people define it as such. Then another theme that came up quite often was nothing's going to last. Mother Nature is going to change it. Everything built is temporary. I don't think any of us will live long enough here. Heard that very, very often. The question is, what do you do with that if you have such an attitude? We live on borrowed time very often. And that from different age groups, younger people, actually particularly younger people who mention we live on borrowed time. And nothing's going to last one way or another. Whoops. The evidence of awareness, I'm just picking out one theme. Of course, I could pick a lot more. I have started on a web page out of my ECU page, and I will do that in the coming weeks, months, that I really group things by theme and then have statements coming underneath. And if you ever are sleepless at night and want to click on it and see what other people are saying, maybe it amuses you. But I wanted to share this with you because these themes also came up rather often. The dunes make the island vulnerable. Whoops. We made a big mistake. We built up the dunes and built houses nearby. That should have never happened. And whoops. If the island was never built up, it would have rolled over upon itself, migrating west, and we would have had more shoreline than what's there now. The reason why I wanted to share that with you is because often people, you all know about the arguments on either side of the divide, or is there a divide, but often it comes along with, these people don't understand, right? I mean, one thing that we were really floored about is it's not about not understanding. That's for sure. People understand, and people have a pretty good idea of what's going on. So it's not ignorance by any means. It's all about the values. So, and then we've got something like we fool ourselves into thinking that we have nice natural beaches, but we have stopped the natural process, and that's why we need beach nourishment. Whoops. So, sea level rise, anyone? I mean, one of the things I wanted to try and find out is how often do people mention it? Do people come up with it themselves? I didn't ask, do you think sea level rise is happening? Or do you believe in sea level rise? I figured that with the many of our questions, people either bring it up or they don't bring it up. And actively mentioning only 20%, but a lot of people say water level is changing, it's hard to grasp and see evidence. Whoops. I drive down and so on and so forth, but I can't definitely say I've noticed sea level rise because there's a tide. So there's certainly people trying to grasp with the concept. And I know that there's sea level rise, but I haven't seen it. So there is certainly something where there is an openness to it. A lot of people, I didn't bring you the quotes, but a lot of people describe erosion. I mean, that's something everybody knows exactly where it's happening, how it's happening. Other people would maybe call that, yeah, we can discuss that. But the issue is the verticality. I mean, some people even made it very clear we need a vertical evidence, and that might be something that the colleagues in the sciences might find a good idea or find something to work with in that respect to make it visible, if it's visible. So what about that sorting thing? The sorting thing, making piles. So the question was, and here people had to sort cards, and I'll show you the cards here in a minute. And the question was, and I often facetiously said to people, you know, where would you order your tax dollars to go if you were the king or queen of Dare County? And not just for 1 year, I made it clear, for 5 years or longer, you can really order people about, and where would you put your money? But I had done the preparation ahead of time and brought 18 cards along, and then people were sorting it like this. And some of you maybe have seen that. And so I'm just going to go through this real quick because some of you who haven't ever sorted this maybe want to know what was on the list, right? The long bridge, the short bridge, the high-speed ferry system. Whoops. And then we're going with the jetties, but they don't show up yet. Let me see. No. And I mean, we threw in 18 was maybe a bit much, but we threw in different things, including also things for low-income housing. What else that comes top of my mind? School resources. You see? Aha, there. The jetties, the dunes, beach nourishment, another beach nourishment, wildlife protection, dredging, Mid-Cartuck Bridge. Now, of course, that's not a Dare County tax dollars. But federal, state level, and something that people are affected by, widening US 64, subsidies, housing, vacation homes, improved stormwater systems. Now this one here, not that I didn't say centralized sewage system for the whole area, but little pockets, like what we know in Kill Devil Hills, the Ocean Acres area, little pockets of centralized sewage. Not saying that the whole area would, but just to see what people think about it, and more resources for schools. So that was things to sort. And so there's a lot more to say about this, but I wanted to share with you what these cards were doing. And so we were looking for clusters, how people cluster things together. Whoops. And what's important to remember here, when I show you a picture in a minute, it doesn't say anything about are people for it or against it. The actual clustering task tells us how people see things related to one another. The comments that we got from everybody, that told us I'm for it or I'm against it. So, and I'm going to tell you about that here in a moment. But the actual clustering by itself doesn't say, I love this, I hate this. See if we, whoops. So they show judged similarity, but they don't show the pro or the con. Just that we got that from the comments. And that's what has taken me so long to go through all those comments and which one fits which and so on and so forth. And for 200 something, that was, yeah. So unfortunately, I can't blow this up here. And I'm just going to tell you what it is. And again, I promise to make this more available. Here, I told it to show me what would happen if we had 5 clusters, because a lot of people often created 5 clusters. What you don't see, what you see here is in the middle, that's the Mid-Currituck Bridge. So people were ordering it in a different way. So very, very high disagreement. Some people sorted it with something, some people sorted it by itself. The same thing with the Long Bridge, the Long Bonner Bridge. Some people sorted it together, some people sorted it away from it. Lots of different sorting tasks there. The widening of 64, by the way, a lot of people thought, don't need it, bogus, I don't care for it. That goes together here with lifting houses on stilts and low-cost vacationing. All of these things, we don't need it, that people often clustered that together. And then here, wildlife protection, low-income housing, and school resources, these often found themselves in the same cluster, either as don't want it or want it definitely, either way. And then you know what's all in here. Short bridge jetties, beach nourishment, dune building, Hatteras dredging, Oregon inlet dredging. Some people sorted them apart. They're for Oregon inlet dredging but don't care about the Hatteras dredging, or they're for that beach nourishment but not for the other. But the majority of people consider this, when you do one thing, you do all the other things. And now again, I don't expect you to make sense of this picture, but this is when I look at the respondents. So here there's 288 points somewhere in there. And I would have to blow this up to show you, and if somebody's interested, I'd be happy to play with you. But what this mainly shows is that I was trying to make difference here between the lifetime spent in there, the different areas, Manio, Mines Harbor, beach towns, Hatteras Island, business owner, not a business owner. But what you all can see, even from all the way in the back, is we've got a big thing in the middle where people are not so different. So a lot of people sort these. What that really just tells us is a lot of people sort things in a rather similar way. That's the take home we can take from that. I'm going to go and drill a little bit deeper over the next weeks, where I'm going to just take out the beach towns and see if they by themselves do something differently. So far we can see that insights about the environment and the economic needs is based on similar assumptions. Oops. But it's independent of age, gender, and socioeconomics. People do actually see the things rather similar. Of course, the interpretation of what that all means, that's what differs. The values, that's what differs. I know I'm not really going to tell you anything new, but this is what came up with this. So what to do with Mother Nature? Embrace it, sure, but how? Is beach nourishment the answer? Certainly, because that was the big topic last summer, a lot of people talked more about this. So I brought you a little bit more about this. So there are sentences such as, the Nagshead Beach Nourishment Project was a success. We need to do projects like that because the beach is our biggest resource. We have, the beach is always going to going to be there. It just might not be where it is today. Trying to preserve these beaches is like pissing in the wind, sorry. Eventually it's going to do what it's going to do. I hate the expense of beach nourishment, and it might just last 4 years or so, but it's helped the economy and helped us stay. So we basically have this distribution, and in terms of numbers, I was actually surprised that almost 40% of all the people we talk to, and I break it down here in a minute, that's where the socio-demographics matter, they're against it. Among the supporters, 1/3 supported without reservations, but 2/3 with reservations. So I know we started, that's where the dunes thing comes in. I know we started all this. At some point we should have never started it, but now that we started it, so if we look at it a little bit closer and look at the proportions, it's, of course that's difficult to see, but you do see the purple is people 50 to 59 years old, and this one is people 40 to 49 years old. So what does that tell you? Here's a slightly different way. Younger and older residents differ from the middle. The blue is full support, no reservation. The red is support with reservation. The green is no support. So in terms of proportions, you can see the younger people have the least full support people, and the older people have, the elderly, people have the least full support. And the people in the middle have proportionally the biggest support, with reservation, but support we must. But it's not just a matter of the position in the life cycle, it's also a matter of how long you've been a local. Of course, that's been a discussion that's probably on its way out, who's local, who isn't local. I've heard some really interesting things about the license plates, not the license plates, and all that. I mean, you guys are much better in that whole thing, and I mean, that would be a whole other topic. But you can also see that full support is mostly given by this group, those who spend 25 to 50% of their lifetime at the beach, right? And then the others to various proportions. And finally, or is it just about the money? Business owners versus self-employed versus employed versus retired. I had that teased out too. And here I didn't give you the income levels. But full support, I'm probably not a surprise, right, for business owner. And retired folks, less so. More of the retired people, no support of beach nourishment. So you can mull this over. What does that mean? What are we going to do with that? Should the younger people have compassion for those people who are trying to make ends meet? Or should the people in the middle have more compassion for the younger ones and know that once they're maybe older, they see life differently? Oops. So those are certainly things to ponder, and we've got lots and lots of statements where this is discussed, where this is really coming up. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it, but I have to. I have to feed my family. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen with the next storm. Another thing that often came up with was we've seen nothing yet. I mean, Ash Wednesday storm was the last big storm. Since then, we haven't really seen anything, no? What would happen if we had a big storm, and now is now and tomorrow is another thing. So a very different interpretation of this. We're all here on borrowed time, right? Oops, but now it's not moving. So one of the things I certainly did take away from it is the economy is on everybody's mind. And maybe we should do and work with that a little bit, embrace that in one way or another and make that work towards wherever you want to have it working. Whoops, that's too fast. Maybe I'm going too fast. Whoops. Oh. There. I mean, one of the things was here, let nature take its course, but let me make money first.
I think once you get to retire, then you
Yeah. I mean, then we can talk about nature again. And I mean, again, I see my job in sort of giving you the mirror. And you do with it what you want to do with it. And again, in individual discussions, and that's why it might be fun to come to smaller groups and then direct the conversation. Whoops. just a little bit more context, but I go over it quickly. We can talk about it a little bit more later. Awareness is localized. Hatteras is different than Mans Harbor, Manio people, and different from the beach towns. I will present something in Hatteras, maybe March, early April, where I'm talking a little bit more specific on things. The Hatteras people are the most coherent in their messages, in their ideas. Lots of things fall into place there. Emotions, of course, run high, nothing new, don't regulate me. There is certainly something that a lot of people can agree on. And I mean, you can all tell I'm not bringing you the most outrageous statements. You all have heard the most outrageous statements. Tourism is considered the only ticket. I already said most of the people say we've seen nothing yet. We also already just seen that many of the people who came from outside, who are now in their 40s and 50s and in business, they're mostly on the side of let's control what we can control. And what was also interesting, and that even people who are very much for non-interference and who said let nature do its thing and all that beach nourishment doesn't make sense, but when it came to Oregon Inlet needs to be kept open. So in some ways, and people often said that to me, so I feel it's okay to share that with you. A lot of people came away with it and said, I guess I'm a hypocrite, or I guess I'm not all following through, or something like that. So, I mean, that is sort of, again, giving it back to you. If nature absolutely does take its course, then Oregon Inlet should have been maybe allowed to do what it wants to do. Also, this is something many of you are also very much familiar with, that one of the reasons where the Long Bridge is sorted by itself is then that beloved Pea Island would be much more difficult to get to. That's also a statement that we heard very often. So, and finally, I mean, I'm not quite summing it up, but one other thought is the discussion of the changes to the social environment. There is a lot of what does it mean to be local and the way we were, but there's also awareness that society has changed. And so the beach has lost its sense of community. It's a crying shame that they have lost the small town atmosphere. For me, as an outsider coming in, is of course a lot of things I've seen is there is a lot of urban sprawl, of course, particularly going on in the beach towns. There's still lots of wonderful pockets of community, but it's much more difficult to influence people or much more difficult to reach people. And that's going to be most likely the biggest challenge going forward, to get some coherence. But it is not impossible. So we're busier and we're more self-centered. The community is highly transient. People weren't born here, but they bring different perspectives. People are not cohesive and they think autonomously. That's actually nice. Let's make use of that, right? I don't know if you guys, let me see. Some of you know, and there's a lot more to it. We also talked about fracking a little bit. I didn't bring anything to that extent. Most people were against fracking. But in terms of wind turbines, really interesting, one of these sentence completion tasks, what would happen if we had wind turbines? Surprisingly, a lot of people actually welcome it. The few people that didn't like it, and there were, some of them were actually the retired folks or the older folks, and a lot of it had to do with how far out of sight things were. If it's really far out of sight, then I'm okay with it. But if it's, if it's an eyesore, I don't want it. And then the discussion of the birds is also very important and I think needs to be addressed. And then people who didn't want it said it's not cost effective. And maybe there's some room for communication, some room for getting people to talk about things. And another thing that might be, interesting, the sewage issue. Again, these smaller things. Would you welcome it if there would be something like that in your neighborhood? Actually, a lot of people, once they got into it, they started talking about it. The hygiene issues. Of course, a lot of people also said it depends on price of water and density prevention. That's actually the big sore spot. And a lot of people, of course, not surprising, wouldn't support it, mainly because it would cost more. But also, and that I found very interesting, I've heard that very, very often, most of you are aware of that. But this is sort of kind of our last defense, the last defense against density. You can't have these little pockets of sewage systems because then we would become Virginia Beach or Myrtle Beach. So there's really the culture of we don't trust each other. And yeah. So density is actually the game changer. And I would invite everybody to kind of think about that, what to do with that. This is not going to go away here. I brought you some pictures. 1962 on the one side, Wright Memorial there in the corner, 2003 on the other. I mean, that speaks volumes. The density is here. Now, of course, compared to other places in the world, it's still low density. It's still low density. But that's why the sewage often came up, even if I didn't bring it up. It is something some people are worried about. It's sort of kind of the hush-hush topic we don't really talk about. But it sums up very interesting where really the problem lies. Where it's not local anymore. It's not about being born here. It's not that thing that people who were born here know better. It's, you know, a lot of people just have to deal with what they have to deal with at, you know, the very location they're living in. And what's also interesting, I mean, in American culture, we're very used to having low density. And low density actually also allows us to have these polarized opinions. Because if you don't like it here, you can go elsewhere. But those people who love it here, they can't go elsewhere. They have to deal. And everybody has to deal, because there is somebody already living where you are, and somehow you have to make this work with making the money and making the having the water quality being steady. I mean, one thing that a lot of people mentioned was, well, I'd wish there would be some gates that we could put up and, you know, stop people from coming in. I mean, that's a running joke. I know that many of you heard these kind of sayings too. But, I mean, the density is here to stay, and the density needs to be managed. So now I'm getting to some concluding remarks. So a lot of middle-of-the-road opinions. Really, in the end, it's not as black and white. Of course, the people I talk to are not the people who are making the decisions. They're not the people you hear in the news. Those are your friends and neighbors who I had to arm wrestle in saying their opinions. Uncertainty about economic future is more real than the uncertainties about the storms. So here's something that, you know, that's reality. I don't know, we all live paycheck to paycheck. There are various economic constraints. If in doubt, what are we going to choose? Are we going to choose nature? We want to preserve nature, and we want to preserve the natural processes. But very few people are willing to do that at the expense of getting, you fill it in, a new iPhone, something else. Or, I mean, it's maybe not so much about the consumer goods. For a lot of people, it's just the reality of making ends meet. And it's not so much about those extra things. Or is it, you know, on the other hand, I mean, am I willing for economic prosperity and safety and security, that I'm willing to let nature be a little bit more or a little bit managed, manhandled. We've already talked about that. Urban sprawl, reality meets trust in small town community. There could be bridges built, but that would be certainly the task for the people here in Dare County. Urban reality doesn't need to be a bad thing. It can actually be a good thing. You've got lots of different subcultures, subgroups. The problem is, of our day and age, how to communicate between those groups, because the traditional structures are not working that way anymore, that everybody goes to church or everybody goes to a particular club or something like that. And there's the life cycle that I already mentioned. You think about that. How are you going to negotiate that? You've got young people in your network. You've got older people in your network. Where do you want to bridge? So what's the culture of Dare County? We could maybe talk about this further. This is the least developed because I'm still thinking about it and thinking about coming up with good lines. So maybe some of you can help me with that. So I see many subgroups bridging localities. Hatteras is the most by itself in terms of the winter overcrew, if you will. But everybody else is actually interconnected. It's not so much, sure, the beach towns have their own culture, but a lot of people from Manio work in the beach towns and vice versa. There is certainly love and respect for natural processes. That's something we can all agree on. People are resilient and resourceful. Then there's pride in low density. That's why many people are here, because if they didn't want to have the low density, they would go to the urban areas, and they can toughen it out through the winters. But in many cases, the low density isn't really there anymore. And of course, that's another thing. There is compassion for property owners. At the end of the day, or compassion for ourselves. This is certainly something that's not the case so much in every place in the world. Is realism stronger present or idealism stronger present? You be the judge. I put the question marks there. Always being the data cruncher, I still want to tally a little bit more before I give my final verdict. I put realism first. That are people adverse to change? Is that the culture here? We just don't want to change. What certainly might help in these value wars, because in the end it is about values, not so much how you see the world or how you understand things, but it's about values. And if one could agree on the identity of the Outer Banks being the main thing, or that nature is our business, then we certainly might overcome some of these fractions. And coping versus adaptation revisited. Many people have said humans are part of nature too, so we need to adapt accordingly. Our vulnerability here is real, something to deal with. And economic stability is also key for adaptation measures. So whatever is going to happen next, managing people is a challenge. It's not managing so much the bridges, it's all about managing people, but you know that. And so somehow these things need to overlap, right? This all needs to come together somehow and link to one another. And so, as I hopefully was able to show you, is people who sat down with us, they were kept anonymous, their names didn't show up. What I would really like to do, and what this study hasn't done, is to understand how information flows and how to reach each other, because that might be something that could help us get more connection and more traction between people. And sometimes I do social network analysis, trying to create pictures like that. So if maybe in the future some UNC students or some ECU students want to interview you about your social networks, fear not. We will not get your contacts or so in any which way, but it would be something that's really missing to truly understand how people interact with one another, how does information travel, and who's talking to whom. So I think that's another need for information. As I said, I'm still working on it, and I'm still getting new insights. I left some of the mileposts over there because if you wanted to read some of the things I said, there's a nice article that Matt Walker wrote about after interviewing me, so some of the statistics are in there. And it's a whole issue about nature, so if you want to keep thinking about these kind of things. Yeah.